When it comes to reviewing performance, leaders can come up with the most outrageous reasons why they aren't doing it. Anything from, I assume they already know how to do it, to Mercury is in retrograde and it may cause misunderstandings. But outrageous excuses aside, many leaders genuinely struggle when it comes to reviewing the performance of their teams, their projects, their direct reports. They're just unsure of how to assess performance against expectations or pinpoint those all-important areas for development. And get this, a surprising number of them don't even feel like it's their place to review performance, or as some frame it, pass judgment, even though that's a core part of their role. Intriguing, right? Well, stay tuned and get the down low on this accountability blocker and what it is that you can do about it.
Welcome to Dismantling Dysfunction, a podcast series for anyone who is ready to eliminate the dysfunction they experience in their organizations, leaders, or relationships. Each week, we explore common dysfunctions in organizations, delving into the systemic causes behind them, and giving you the exact tools and practical tips you need to dismantle them. Now, here are your hosts, organizational development and behavioral change experts, Dr. Anne Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. We are continuing our series on accountability, tackling the widespread issue of its dysfunction in organizations. And in our last episode, we explored the challenges that leaders face when it comes to confronting performance or gaps in performance because of their beliefs and associations with what confronting means and the damage that they fear it can do. Now, today we're diving into the next crucial step in the accountability process, reviewing the performance. And as we move to the last stage of the performance cycle, the review for growth, we will discuss the accountability action review and some reasons why leaders gloss over it or fail to do it altogether. Now, before we continue, make sure that you hit the subscribe button if you're catching us on YouTube. Turn on that notification bell to stay updated with our latest leadership videos. If you're catching us live in LinkedIn, make sure you connect with us and follow us, and then so you don't miss out on a single one of our episodes. And again, if you're catching this on our audio podcast, we really do appreciate you giving us a review and a rating if you're finding our content valuable. Now, let's continue to explore the epidemic of a lack of accountability in organizations.
Hey, everyone, and thanks for joining today. We've named this Reviewing for Growth because we want to get leaders' mindsets out of this notion that the review is a one-time event. And it's actually the time when leaders take that time to reflect on performance relative to expectations and determine what was completed effectively and what wasn't. And this allows thought about the next steps for development or improvement. And when we talk about this stage of the accountability cycle, we're not just talking about what that one event or the traditional annual performance review for employees. This can be a project milestone, a quarterly team review, some event that's been held where we do due diligence afterwards, or a postmortem, I should say, or any delegated task. The end of an accountability cycle is determined by the needs of the project, the team, or the employee, rather than that idea that it's just calendar driven. This makes reviewing performance something that's more organic and ongoing in the accountability cycle, something done with employees for their benefit and for the benefit of the team and organization as well.
Yeah, it's like this big shift in mindset, right? Is like, as a leader, I'm constantly measuring the performance. Did that performance meet the expectation? And it's on micro activities, like Anne said, tasks. But it's also what it does. It allows us in the review process to really recalibrate expectations. It allows us to recognize and acknowledge progress, to celebrate successes along the way. But it also really allows us to stay connected to our people and their performance. Does it when you think about it, right? right? Is that it's this continuous feedback loop that the review stage really is reinforcing. So employees always know where they stand, and they also know what it is that they can work on in order to maintain that continuous improvement approach to their own work. And so really when we think about this is when we, as Anne said earlier, it's like somewhere along the way organizations turned this into the idea that it's sort of this one time or twice a year. I know for some of our clients, they do it quarterly. What we're talking about here in the accountability cycle, though, it's an ongoing, we're doing it every single day as leaders, every time we stop to really measure where the progress has gotten to. And that constant communication is so fundamental to supporting our employees to be engaged, to continue to grow and develop, and to help prevent that quiet quitting, because they are engaged in this process with us. So we don't wait time, like time does not pass before we say to them, hey, this thing that you did 8 months ago wasn't so great. Like, that's not a useful conversation in the accountability process. We're catching things in real time. That worked, that didn't work. Let's think about what we can do to make this more effective the next time. And here's the best part of all of this is that regular check-ins like this mean there's no surprises, but it also means that we as leaders get much more transactional in this process. It doesn't feel like this big thing. It's just, oh, it's time for me to measure and review. It's time for us to talk about where things ended up and what we want and what we learned from it, what we want to see differently next time. So no surprises. We're taking all the surprises out of this conversation. The clarity is always there. Everyone's on the same page, and we're making those minor adjustments, right? It's, well, next time we do this, let's make sure we X, right? Before we go into this next time, let's make sure we spend more time up front really talking about the expectation and what it's going to look like. It's much more flexible. Honestly, it feels way more human, and it doesn't feel like this burdenous thing that we get into. But strangely, the action of reviewing performance is something that leaders just, they avoid doing.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And what we've found is many leaders are so much more comfortable and interested in just whizzing past reviewing with either their team or individual employees by saying something superficial like, hey, good job, or we could have done a better job, and then moving on. And when leaders are uneasy about diving deep into performance details and really getting involved with their employees' development and where they are on their path to mastering in their roles, their comments lean more toward being vague or deflection, or let's get on with the good stuff of starting something new. I'm thinking about a client who recently told me he was disappointed with his team's performance. And instead of reviewing with them the aspect of their performance that didn't meet his expectations, he said to them, we can touch on specifics later. For now, let's just focus on what we're doing in the next quarter, leaving employees with that feeling of, oh my God, I've done something wrong. I have no idea what it was. I don't know how I contributed to not meeting it. And my boss isn't going to let me in on it. I'm going to have to ask if I want more information. So he actually chose not to review with his team just to avoid that discomfort of a possible difficult conversation with himself and team members.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one too, because even if we take it out of the context of, feedback or reviewing the performance of an individual, I'm thinking of an example in a client recently where we were working on really standardizing expectations for a particular process or way in which things were produced in their organization. And we'd been working on this for months with this particular client. And one of the senior leaders at the most recent meeting made a comment of, we really need to get better at this thing. And I'm like, this thing had never come up before. We didn't even realize that it was a performance gap or a quality gap that was going on in the production process. And and when we said, well, can you give us more details about it? Like, what is it and what you think is contributing to it? So it's not just about pointing the finger at it, but it's getting into the meat of what is going on and depersonalizing it. I know we talked about the depersonalizing previously as well in some of these episodes, but really not making it about the individual, but what is the cause of that gap? What is the issue that we need to solve for? And actually thinking about your review step as that opportunity to really problem solve and to plan out or drive out any of these things that might be causing the gaps. And if you're not going to get in and talk about it and have that conversation in Anne's example and my example, you don't actually move into that improvement. And those mistakes continue to get repeated because people don't understand and it's not being talked about, not being surfaced. So beyond just avoiding those difficult conversations, if you think about too, the leaders, they get stuck in some of their old memories of past annual performance reviews that were uncomfortable. But I also think they're that piece, as I was just saying, is like that avoidance of feeling like they're passing judgment or pointing something out. And with some of my clients, I think, well, they don't want to point this out because then somehow that reflects poorly on them as well. And so it just goes without being discussed. And so again, that image that we invoke about the annual review, the dreaded annual review, and where everyone gets a bit nervous, dresses up a little bit extra, has that formal sit down. But this is more organic, as I mentioned earlier. It's a more dynamic, ongoing discussion and iteration, and getting really comfortable with saying this measured up, this didn't measure up, this is what we need to do differently going forward. And so again, we're not putting it out in that sort of annual check-in, kind of like when we go to our doctor's office once a year. This isn't the intention behind this one. We're really driving and leading for accountability. And we don't want to have this buildup where everyone just feels relieved that it's over, because when we build it up in that way, there's so much emotionality around it that we rarely see action. And that's a big part of the review process. It needs to lead to action. It needs to move us back into that planning for success step that is so fundamental, but we have new information and new inputs to support that.
Yeah, and it's always interesting, Heather, just to add to your examples there. When we talk about them shifting to more of this process of looking at an ongoing conversation with their employees and really bringing employees or teams in closer to review what is actually going on. One of their points of resistance is always, it's too time consuming. And we've said this many times in our podcast that employees can't be engaged if their leaders aren't engaged with them. And so if leaders aren't doing that act of knowing what their employees are doing, they can't do their job of being involved in reviewing their performance relative to expectations. The good news is that it really doesn't take that much time when you're conducting the review as a step in the accountability cycle. It only takes significant time when leaders haven't been using accountability actions like that involvement, the directing, the coaching, the correcting, the confronting when necessary, all of those steps that we've already talked about. And when it's just life unfolding and evolving in the workplace around their performance. And there is a huge difference between a leader who hasn't been involved with their employees' performance, sometimes saving all feedback to the end of the year or biannual review, and a leader who has ongoing involvement. One leader comes down from the mountain while other one is walking on the same path as their team or their employees.
I like that imagery because it feels like that. Like when I go back to my example, it's like all of a sudden he showed up and gave information, and it was like, and then gone, right? Then
yeah.
It's and it's not about being too time consuming. I mean, we often say that when people say that, they're just making up excuses, right? In order to get to avoid it. And really what it is that reluctance, right? Like at a fundamental level, there's this reluctance to engage more deeply with the team. There's the reluctance to talk about these things in an honest way, again, for how it makes them feel, how it might reflect on them. And, the underlying reason could be a lack of confidence in their leadership skills. And I think sometimes too, with the review process, they don't want to talk about it because they don't have the answer. right? To move to action and not separating those two things out. Is like, let's just focus on the review and the information that comes from that. Then we can decide what we need to do about it in order to move into that solving for it, right? And, again, if leaders are feeling overwhelmed with their responsibilities, where leading is being done off the side of their desks, as we often talk about, then it's no wonder that these things get avoided, or there's the, now's not a good time, I'll bring it up another day. And then, we've seen clients where we've had this where we go back and forth, and they're like weeks and weeks later, and they still haven't had that conversation. And now it's too late, right? So reviewing that frequently does require a leader to be consistent and present. We talk about some of the accountability structures, like weekly meetings that allow that protected time to make sure the review can happen, the measurement can happen. Not everybody feels equipped for these sorts of things. And when you're not regularly tuned in as a leader, of course, everything feels more overwhelmed. And you are also likely working out of reactive mode, right? So you don't have the time to shift into being more proactive and more considered in some of these conversations, because you're constantly fighting fires. So all of those kind of keep you stuck in this gap around accountability, for sure.
So you bring up in your example there, Heather, and what you just said, some of the things that will stop leaders from having these conversations, that lack of confidence or other responsibilities are a priority. But one of the things that many leaders fear is the degree of subjectivity that's involved in assessing and reviewing an employee or a team's performance. And that in part, they haven't been trained for this. We talk about this a lot, where leaders and managers just aren't getting the training that they actually need, or they have been doing it once a year, and then next year they forget how they did it the previous year. And they haven't been tracking through making notes or documenting conversations. They don't have anything that will help them guide the conversation around the review with their employee. And anything documented, while some people might call this a little bit too corporate or a little bit too time consuming, it actually is necessary to keep it objective. Ongoing note-taking, for example, that makes sure that any conversation about the review and where someone is in terms of, where they started in their task, and where they are and what they still have to master, based on documentation, based on objectivity. But leaders, because of some insecurity in them or inexperience, they become unnecessarily concerned of how their assessment's going to be perceived, whether it's going to be perceived as unbiased or biased or unfair in some way. And of course, when leaders are contributing to this by not taking notes or not having these important conversations in the accountability cycle, they leave the employee thinking that they're doing a whole lot better than they've actually done. And even in a shorter performance cycle, that may end up with a very uncomfortable conversation when the leader has to review it. And of course, the anticipating that uncomfortable conversation again leads the leader to avoid saying anything at all. And, their insecurity about potentially being perceived as unfair or subjective, again, these things are all rooted in our fears, in our emotional brain, things that we've experienced, but they can really be blockers and detractors from leaders moving in and getting more involved with reviewing their employees' performance.
We talk about that idea of a leader that is not comfortable standing there in their leadership role and saying, because I am the leader, I am the one who determines if it meets the expectations or it doesn't, if it, is it successful, is it not? And so it's interesting, as Anne was, and as you were talking about that, as I think about all of our clients who do, it's almost like the who am I to, right? Like,
yeah,
what we said earlier. And not recognizing that that is a fundamental aspect of a leader, and that leaders need to feel entitled to be the one that sets the standards. It doesn't mean you can't shift it or change it. The leader's job is to, step into that place of judgment to determine, did that meet what we set out to do? Did it not? And if it didn't, what do we need to do about it? That's just fundamental to that sort of governing of performance that goes on in the organization. And again, I think it's so easy in the lack of skill, the lack of training, that really not internalizing what we're entitled to as leaders with this, because we do get pushback, and we hear it from our clients all the time, right? But I'm afraid they're going to say this, or I'm afraid, and I don't want to be seen as autocratic, and so we've confused so many leadership activities that are essential for success and impact, effectiveness as a leader, with this notion of, well, I'm going to look autocratic, and I don't want that. And so we sort of always talk about swinging to the other side of it. And they convince themselves, right? It's this emotional reasoning, as Anne talked about. They convince themselves that it's not that bad. Nobody's really complaining. I have a client of ours who will not track certain metrics, because if they did, they would then have to have conversations about the fact that these metrics are not being hit. And so it's just easier for them not to manage their business to these critical performance factors than actually engage in those conversations. So we're really working on building their tolerance for saying, this is the expectation, this is the KPI, this is the standard we're measuring against, and we're going to monitor it. And if you're off, we're going to come back and have a conversation about the fact that it's off. And so operating out of this no news is good news mentality just, again, shifts into this reliance on superficial indicators, right? Nobody's complaining, or we hit the schedule, or they'll pick one arbitrary metric and sort of leave out all of the rest of what might have gone on from a performance perspective. You have one client that will spend a whole bunch of money fixing issues after the fact, but then say that they were successful because they hit the schedule or the timeline, right? So you see what they do in this process to avoid these kinds of conversations. They just, again, all of this, and why it's so important when we think about accountability, is the accountability process is about being really close to what is going on in our business and with our people. Accountability is really about how leaders lead their business and their people to achieve those results. And so the reviewing of it, that checking in, the measuring, where are we at, what's the progress, it doesn't, if we're not only doing it based on a complaint or a crisis, we're sort of missing all of that opportunity in and around that to drive improvements in profit, drive improvements in performance, drive the engagement of our people around what it is that they're doing, because they're excited and aligned around that measurement as well. So again, moving to a more proactive approach is so critical, because it bolsters that leader-employee relationship, which in today's environment, especially with the virtual work, with the quiet quitting, really, really important from a retention perspective and a discretionary performance perspective, but it meets the needs of the employees. And that gives them that sense of belonging, that sense of security, that recognition they need to really feel like they've got a purpose there at work, and they're able to show up and do their best performance, knowing where it is that they stand at all times.
And I think of all of our clients, Heather, who believe the lies that they tell themselves and really take it for cash when they say, well, they don't need anything. If they needed something, they'd ask. And if they want it reviewed, they would have asked. And they don't realize, because of their absence of developed self-awareness, for example, they don't stop and think, am I just making an excuse here? I know, I'm supposed to be walking down this road of employee engagement and getting more involved with my people, and stop being so polarized in that arena of the functional leadership, which, of course, that area makes leaders feel a sense of their own strength and power and mastery at work. But they have to start dipping their toe in this water a little bit at a time by getting involved and staying involved. Otherwise, they'll keep using these excuses like no news is good news as a shield. And convincing themselves that silence equals satisfaction. I know how my employees feel. They love working for me, and a client say that to me recently. And she was shocked when there was an intervention done because all of her employees were actually complaining about her, and so they remain in their comfortable bubble. I think, therefore I am. I think everything is great, therefore it is. And not looking at and assessing themselves and reviewing their own performance against what is really expected of them to foster accountability in this organization. And if they're afraid of this deeper connection with their people, they're uncomfortable with the degree of vulnerability that they need to demonstrate and experience in those performance conversations. They need to own it. And as I said, they have to start building tolerance to the challenges and giving feedback, and having employees act in an unexpected way so that they can build some competence around dealing with issues as they arise and gaining some mastery themselves in reviewing performance and making sure that there is relationship built and engagement with each and every one of the employees.
Yeah, and I think just as we sort of move in to wrap this episode up, as you were talking there, that what came into mind is that it's just that reminder always that what gets measured gets done, right? And if we're talking about accountability, and leading for accountability means we are, again, aligning everything that's going on in our organization and through our people to a particular endpoint. And if we're not measuring that, which is what the review step in the process is all about, if we're not actually taking the time to measure and really talk about the measurement that happens at this particular point in time, we're missing out on that opportunity, or that place in that process that employees know, well, I'm going to need to do this because I'm going to get measured on it at the end of the day. And so if there's no measurement, it doesn't get done. So just a quick reminder about that one. So going to drop the gem for our podcast. This is where we're going to give you a little bit more of a specific takeaway that you can put into action right away. And, reviewing performance has evolved dramatically. And we know organizationally, from an accountability perspective, leaders cannot rely on the once a year nerve-wracking performance reviews if they want to foster accountability. So starting to separate those two things, that accountability is a very different process than our annual review processes or quarterly review processes in organization. So leaders have to really transform their mindset and the outdated beliefs around accountability in order to step into that place of continuously reviewing and discussing and measuring performance from a growth, engagement, and accountability perspective. That action of reviewing, measuring, and ensures people are aligned and moving forward, and also make sure that we're not continuing to repeat and recreate performance gaps that might have come as a result of the way it was done the prior time. As I said, that example that I gave where they keep doing the same thing over and over again in the production process and nobody's measuring it and talking about it, except it came up as an ad hoc comment in a meeting, where as opposed to an area for focus. So here, the action of reviewing, again, it makes sure that we've measured it, everyone's aligned, we're all moving forward with that same understanding of the success or the progress that we achieved and what it is that we need to be doing going forward. Leaders avoid this action, they do a huge disservice to themselves, to the team, to individual employees, and ultimately to the organization, because the cost behind not measuring and not having these meaningful review conversations that get into the details about what actually happened from a performance perspective. Leaders have to take the time. So if you're a leader, take the time to actually confront yourself. What are the reasons? What are those excuses that you're using that keep you from going into that review, that measure step of the accountability process? Look at those accountability and performance gaps that you are experiencing today. Reach out and get the coaching that you need to develop this important accountability action.
And on that note, that's a wrap for this episode of Dismantling Dysfunction. As always, we're your hosts, Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, and myself, Dr. Ann Dranitsaris. Thank you so much for listening, and join us again for our next episode, where we explore our last but not least important accountability action: to engage. We'll be discussing how leaders can gloss over the opportunity to engage, build on their relationship, and focus on fostering a sense of belonging at the end of a task, project, or performance cycle. And remember, if you're feeling challenged about the accountability gap in your organization or in your leaders and want to know more about what you can do about it, why not register for our free webinars? We're holding them weekly on why leaders avoid fostering accountability. And we'll give you some insight into the 5 key mistakes that leaders make when they're trying as best they can to foster accountability in their organization, but they're not hitting their targets. And we'll give you the exact blueprint as well that you can implement to foster accountability in your organization.
So thank you. I'm going to add my thanks as well. We'd love to see you in the webinar. Always a great opportunity for us to connect a little bit differently with our audience. We really appreciate you investing your time here, either watching us or listening to us, depending on the platform that you are using, in order to take away insights in the competencies that leaders need to master the stage, or master setting up the stage for alignment and accountability in your organization. And don't forget, just a quick reminder, you can catch all of our LinkedIn Live videos and podcasts on our YouTube channel, Dranitsaris-Hilliard. We've also got a lot of other video content that's there around a lot of these leadership dysfunctions and other topics that we cover through our work with our clients. And if you found this information valuable, again, we really appreciate you taking the time to give the video a thumbs up, to give us a rating on your favorite podcast platform, or share what it is that we're talking about with other leaders that you think could benefit from the insights that we're sharing. Again, thank you for being in our audience, and we look forward to seeing you and having you back again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Dismantling Dysfunction podcast with Dr. Ann Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, organizational development and behavioral change experts. Be sure to subscribe to get more practical insights and focused tools to help you dismantle dysfunction in your organizations, leaders, or relationships. For more information, visit dismantlingdysfunction.com.